Fairly often I get a comment either on Twitch or YouTube that uses champion win rate as an argument for why a champion is strong or weak. And I especially see this whenever I post a new tier list or something and I get questions about like, why is Anivia a champion with like a 52% win rate in D tier, and then why is, maybe a champion like Aurora, something that has like maybe 47, 48% win rate, how could she possibly be an A tier? So in this video, I want to talk about, why champion win rate, especially on its own, is kind of a bait, and talk about how you can actually figure out which champions are strongest. So let's actually just take a look at the champion win rates themselves. So if we come here and we go to say Gold Plus, just so we can see everything, let's filter by mid, and let's take a look at the high win rates. So we've got things like Quinn, Neferi, Anivia. And then if we go to the low win rates, we've got, the Corki, Smolder, Mel, even a lot of champions that get played in higher elos here, things like the Trist, or the Azir, or the Aurora. Just to make sure it's not just an OPGG thing, if you come over to these other sites like Low Elo, you'll see the same thing, a lot of the same champions repeated. And if you go over to DPM LoL, they actually don't even have things like Corki and Trist on here, but kind of same thing, right? You'll see a lot of these things like Azir and Aurora low, and then I guess they've gotten rid of things like the Quinn, but again, you see like the Anivia, the Neferi, the Swain, Annie, etc. So you might be wondering, like if these champions, at least win rate wise, are so shit, basically, like why would you see them in competitive? Or like what do they even play in competitive? So if you come over to picks of the week, you can, I can link this in the description if you're curious. You can come and set, so this is like the last week. You can filter if you want by the top leagues, which we'll probably do just to make sure that we're getting the like most highest level competitive play, and you can come through and you can see that there's some champions here with like really low win rate and solo queue that actually are getting played. So you see the Azir, you see the Aurora, Trist is here, Corki is here. If we get rid of that, just to expand to, actually, is there a way to get rid of that? I think there is. If I just refresh that again. Yeah, so if you want to see, like, obviously it's like a wider sample size, but you will see some champions on here, things like the Smolder obviously has like a very low win rate mid. I think, what else in here? Yeah, like LeBlanc, obviously it's like 0-2 in competitive, but it's getting picked, right? And it's unlikely that it would be getting picked if people thought the champion were trash. And you can also take a look at bans as an indication of this. Things like 32 Aurora bans or 28 Tristana bans, right? Clearly, in higher level play, or in at least in competitive play, people tend to consider these champions that are low win rate and solo queue to be very, very strong. Of course, though, this is for competitive, and competitive has its differences to solo queue. So next we're going to take a look at solo queue and see what people are playing there. So if we come over to some of the higher ranked mids in Korean solo queue, so this is like Bulldog, for example, rank 13, you will see, again, similar champs on here. You have things like the Azir, the Tristana, the Aurora, things that they're playing. This is Rookie's OPGG here, where he's got, again, some Aurora, some Corki on the list. If we go over to Faker's OPGG, it's like, what have we got here? We've got, again, Victor, Aurora. There's some Tristana in the match history. Go over to Chovi's, again, more Corki, amongst other things. And Showmaker even has like a game of Smolder. There's some Corki, some LeBlanc, some Trist, some Corki. So clearly, again, it's not just in competitive play where they value some of these champions that are like lower win rate and solo queue. And there's a couple takes you could have on that. The first one is that, okay, it's possible that they're just playing these champions to practice for competitive, right? Like they might be willingly picking a champion that is, say, not good in solo queue to practice it for competitive. That is possible, right? I'm not going to say it's like impossible, but I would say that the difference between solo queue and competitive is not as much from champions as it is from other things. So for example, I think that solo queue and competitive are different because like which opponent you're playing against, right? Like you have bans against them, you have comms, you have like fearless draft and stuff. But in terms of like what champions are actually powerful in the game, I would say it's like mostly similar. And that's because like the game just over time has become more similar to solo queue, right? Like even in competitive, even if there's less kills, the game is still very fast-paced, right? There are things to fight for. There's things like, the Grubs, Dragon, Scuttle, Atacon. Like, games are reasonably fast-paced, like solo queue. So it's not like in the past where it was like, okay, competitives are farming AFK Simulator for 30 minutes or whatever, and then in solo queue, it's like a bloodbath. So from that point of view, I disagree with that point, but I could see where you're coming from. The other thing you might be asking or might be thinking is, this is high elo solo queue. Isn't that like really, really different than like low elo play? And the answer is like, yes. But again, like maybe not for the reasons you're thinking. So in my mind, there's like two really big differences about high elo play. One is that the players are a lot better, both at their champions and at the game. And so what that means is that ease of execution, and this is something we'll talk about a bit later in the video, is less of a factor in like, Master Plus game. It's still a factor, right? Like having a champion or a game plan that is easy to execute is really, really valuable. But I would say like in lower elos, ease of execution is probably like the most important thing, or maybe even the only thing that matters when it comes to choosing a champ. Because like when you're making more mistakes, just being able to play your champion or your game plan easier makes like a really, really big difference. And the other thing that I think is really different about high elo play is how much the laning phase matters. So in high elo, people are very good at, knowing how to like extend the lead, whether that's like in a 1v1 or on the map or whatever. So like priority and early game strength matters a lot. There are a lot of champions that scale really hard. Things like Corki or Azir, they're actually very, very good in the 1v1. These champions are not necessarily good early game, like they're not good at skirmishing, but they are quite good in laning phase. And if you play a champ like, I don't know, one of these like higher win rate champs, like something we were talking about before, like Anivia, Anivia has like a pretty weak laning phase. So even if something like Anivia is good, starting at like 10 minutes or so, you might not actually be able to get that point without the game or the lane being in a really difficult position. So let's go back over to our stats page, and I'll talk about what I think the main contributors are to a champion's win rate being high or low. Now, that first one that I've kind of mentioned before is ease of execution. I think ease of execution is one of the biggest things that inflates a champion's win rate. Now, ease of execution, people kind of think it's just mechanical ability. Mechanical ability is one of them. There's also a couple other things. One is how easy is it to pull off their game plan? There are some champions that are easy mechanically but have very difficult game plans, and an example would be something like Smolder. So it kind of straightforward, easy to pull off game plan matters a lot. And then another one is how forgiving is the champion? Like how many mistakes can you make and either get away with them or like not really be punished too hard for them? So let's look at some examples of each of those. Like Ahri is a champion that is actually like sort of difficult mechanically and has a somewhat, difficult to pull off game plan, but she's very forgiving, right? Like if you make mistakes, you've got so much mobility and sustain and stuff on Ahri that you shouldn't really die. So Ahri is a champion that she actually is strong, and maybe we'll come back to that, but Ahri is a champion that even when she isn't strong, tends to always have like a pretty high win rate in solo queue. An example of a champion just with like easy mechanics would be something like Swain, right? I think Swain and higher elos can actually be pretty difficult because like the game plan of playing a weak laner up against like all these strong laning mages is quite hard. But like just because, and especially in lower elos, you don't get punished, the ease of being able to just like play Swain mechanically goes a long way to inflating his win rate. And an example of kind of all of these would be something like Malzahar, right? Like Malzahar is very easy to execute mechanically. His game plan is pretty straightforward of just like push waves and try and get to 5 DPS. And he is pretty forgiving because like you don't need to win early game so much as Malz, right? Like even if you make mistakes, you still have some CC, and it's likely that you will output a lot of damage in the later stage of the game anyway. So, Malz is a perfect example of a champion that has ease of execution in basically every relevant form. The second major factor would be one-tricks. So there are certain champions, and Vel'Koz could be a good example, that are played pretty much exclusively by one-tricks. And this could be that because they're super difficult or because they're very niche or whatever, but you would expect these champions to have higher win rates, right? Because chances are, if you're someone that plays Vel'Koz, you have a ton of games on them, you know how to play the champ, you know how to play the matchups, you know how to build, you know how to team fight, you know everything about Vel'Koz. So you should always expect champions that are played by one-tricks to, generally be higher up on the list. And the third factor, and I want to mention this now because it kind of goes with the one-tricks thing, is how good is it as like a niche pick or as a counter pick. So there are certain champions like Anivia that are really, really good as an answer to specific comps, right? Like Anivia is really, really good against short-range compositions. Anivia also is a one-trick champion, right? So Anivia has such a high win rate because like you would expect that anyone playing Anivia is either Anivia one-trick, so they're really, really good at it, or they've picked it into a composition that is just an absolute turbo banger for Anivia. And it's the same with a lot of these champions here, right? Like Cassio is another good example of this. Mostly a one-trick champion, but sometimes played by people into certain matchups or certain compositions. And if we just flip this win rate around, you will probably see a lot of these champions down here are either like very difficult to play, right? Like things like Azir and LeBlanc that are both, not forgiving, difficult game plans, like really difficult to execute, or you will see picks that are kind of like, picked all the time, right? Like things like Ori or Aurora aren't really played by one-tricks, nor are they niche picks. So these are often going to be played into games that are bad for them, or they're going to be played by people that are not very good at them. So how can we go about actually figuring out which champions are good? So there's a few ways. One is to come and look at tier lists. Now I would say if you're going to look at a tier list, make sure you listen to the explanations. So like this is a tier list for my current patch. If we go to here, this is my current tier list for low elo for the entire season. I would say low elo tier lists don't really change. So you can always come look at this and it'll basically always be relevant. This one has thoughts for every champion. The ones that I post every patch don't have thoughts for for literally every champ, but if you go back, you will eventually be able to find it. I think I did one video at the start of the season where I talked about every champion, and then since then, I've kind of just talked about champions that could change. But if you go back to the start of the season, you should be able to find one that has all the explanations. And the reason I think listening to explanations is really important is because there are a lot of champions that are higher up on this list for specific reasons. So the one that people always call me out for is, how can Smolder be an A tier when his win rate is like super, super low? Especially when there's champions that are, like have really high win rates that are like down here in C tier. So my reasoning, and I'll give you the Smolder reasoning, is that Smolder is really, really good in the meta as a specific answer to one champion, right? So Galio is one of the like premier blind picks. You see Galio mid like all the time. Ideally, if you're counterpicking into Galio, Smolder is basically your best bet. Like Smolder is an absolute slam dunk into Galio. And you'll see that. Like, you'll see here that, Showmaker plays a 10-0 game up against, like, what was probably a Galio blind. But what you'll probably see is if we come over here and we look at the Smolder, if we just go to matchups, and we don't even look at, like, the win rates, but we look at the games it's been played in. Okay, actually, that's fair. It's been played into Malzahar a lot, which is also a very, very good matchup. But you'll see there are a ton of games here into champions that you should not be picking Smolder into, right? Like, either because it's bad, or just because, like, you'd get more value out of something else. So, like, in my mind, you should only really be seeing, yeah, probably, like, Malzahar and Galio. And that would bring his win rate, like, if we just average these, to 49%, which is actually pretty solid, right? But because people don't understand that, they look at the tier list and they're like, oh, this champion being above all these other ones just doesn't make sense. But if you come down and you look at something like this, right, it's like, okay, Anivia 52% win rate. Like, that should definitely be an A tier. And that brings me to my second thing, which is that some champions are lower here because there exists a better option. So a good example of this would, again, be Anivia and Taliyah. So in my mind, Taliyah is a much, much better answer to the things that Anivia is really, really good against. Now, there are maybe some niche cases where like Anivia wall maybe against something like Nunu actually gets more value. But for the most part, there just isn't as much point putting time into Anivia when you can play Taliyah instead because it's stronger. And this is something that Fearless Draft has actually like made a really good impact on the game with, because now there are actually times where you might play Anivia. So if you guys remember, I think it was in I guess it was like the semi-final of G2 vs KC, they played Taliyah into Azir in game number 1. So that means they can't pick Taliyah anymore, right? And then in the last game, they played Anivia into Ryze, because Anivia is a really, really good champ versus Ryze. I really doubt Anivia would have been picked here had Taliyah not been permaban. It's possible, obviously we can't say for sure, but I would say like this is, and it's kind of a tangent, but that's like a really good thing about Fearless, is you get to see champions like this. So the tier list obviously is kind of like, the champions they have their own individual power, but you're always comparing a champion's power to other champions' power, because you can't play two champions at once. So it's like, if Taliyah is available, why would you pick Anivia, even if it's somewhat a solid niche answer? Another good way, and especially if you want to do your own research, is to come to a stats website and filter by pick rate and higher elos. So if we go something like here, Master Plus, and we go by pick rate, I think this generally is more accurate. I still think it's not completely accurate. I do think there are some champions that are overrepresented here, things like Yasuo, but pick rate is going to be much more accurate than win rate. And something that has both a high win rate and a high pick rate, you can probably say is pretty OP. You could look at something like just Challenger, but I find that the sample size is like kind of small. But again, this is like I would say much more accurate than what we're looking at before for deciding how OP a champion is. Something else I like to do is just to, again, go through people's OPGGs. So one good way of doing this is you can go to like Deep LOL or DPM LOL or something. You can come to like EU West or Korea and you can just filter by mid. And then you can just open, all the mid laners OPGGs and just see what they're playing, right? So if we just open like, I don't know, let's just click a bunch of random ones here. You can go through and just like see what people are playing, right? We can see what they're playing recently, right? Last 30 games. We can see, what they're prioritizing, how good their win rates are and stuff like that. And that can be, again, another good way. You might not be able to look at just one person's OPGG, right? For example, if, I don't know, I think one of these guys was like a random like one trick or something. Yeah, so like you could look at Anivia and be like, okay, so this probably says like if you're an Anivia one trick and you're really, really good at it, you can make it work. But the fact is that like since other people aren't prioritizing it, it's probably not like strong in the meta, but clearly like you can get high elo with it. And that's actually a final point I guess I want to make here, is that if something is working for you, just keep doing it, Like I always see people saying like, I've got a really high win rate in this champ, but I'm not sure, like it's low on your tier list, like should I swap to something else? No, just keep going, just keep winning until it becomes a problem, right? If you eventually reach an elo where you get stuck, like then you can stop. But I believe you can reach like pretty close to Challenger, if not Challenger, on like literally any single mid, as long as it's not something super weird like Yumi mid. But for all intents and purposes, like you can get high elo on anything, but certain things are easier than others, specifically the champions with ease of execution, I think are the easiest ones. So I think that's going to be it for this video. If you guys have anything to add or any questions or anything, please put them in the comment section below. Don't forget to like and subscribe. I'll see you guys in the next one.